On October 29, 2025, just 15 nautical miles off the coast of Oahu, the Russian intelligence-gathering vessel Carolina drifted through waters watched closely by the United States. Its antennas were raised high, giving the whole scene the feeling of an old Cold War routine being replayed for a modern audience. But this attempt to send a message to the US Navy was about to turn into a reminder for Moscow. Some old tactics do not work the same way in the 21st century. Moscow says the vessel was upgraded in 2017, but when it comes to Russian naval modernization, that can sometimes look less like a full transformation and more like a new layer of gray paint with a few commercial electronics added on top. Inside the ship, 146 sailors were packed into a tight steel hull, moving through the Pacific at a top speed of just 16 knots. To put that into perspective, that is the kind of speed that would make even a cautious driver on a quiet road feel impatient. But on the bridge, the Russian captain was not focused on speed, he was focused on the antennas. In his mind, this was the day the Americans would react. This was the day they would collect everything. His confidence was impossible to miss. It had the energy of someone walking into a gym for the first time, immediately lifting too much weight, and not realizing everyone already knows how this is going to end. Meanwhile, inside the Joint Operations Center at Indo-Pacific Command, the watch commander looked at the screen for only a few seconds before making the call. Prepare an escort mission. There was an old piece of equipment wandering around where it did not belong, and it seemed to have missed the turn back toward the museum. And that was the moment Russia's move stopped looking like a serious pressure play and started becoming a very public lesson in modern surveillance. For the Americans, the first asset sent to the area was not a billion-dollar destroyer. It was something far more ordinary on the surface, but incredibly effective in practice. An HC-13OJ Super Hercules. Think of the Hercules as the hard-working backbone of the American military. The basic design has been around since the 1950s because it simply refuses to become irrelevant. But this version is not some old cargo plane from history books. It is a flying surveillance platform capable of staying in the air for long missions and watching everything below with remarkable precision. Within 18 minutes of being alerted, it was airborne from Barber's Point and settled into a slow, almost casual orbit about 2,000 feet above the Carolina. From the Russian deck, it may have looked like just a distant aircraft in the sky, but inside that aircraft, the real story was already unfolding. Mounted on the fuselage was the AN/AS-52 multispectral targeting system. That may sound like a complicated technical name, but in simple terms, it is a highly stabilized camera system that makes movie-style surveillance technology look outdated. Its stabilization system cancels out vibration from the massive turboprop engines, movement from wind, and the natural motion of the aircraft in real time. The result is an image so steady and detailed that it feels almost unreal. This is not just about spotting a ship from far away. This is the kind of system that can zoom in with extreme clarity and pick out tiny details on the vessel itself, including markings, equipment, and even small maintenance labels on its surveillance antennas. While the Russian crew continued logging signals and tracking civilian ship movements, they believed their mission was moving forward as planned. But above them, in the calm, air-conditioned interior of the Hercules, the situation looked very different. The Carolina was not the one controlling the moment. It had become the subject of the operation. The American crew was not simply watching a screen. They were creating a full, three-dimensional, real-time intelligence picture of the Russian vessel, with data flowing back to Indo-Pacific Command second by second. The Russians believed they were gathering information near Pearl Harbor. In reality, the U.S. Coast Guard was building a crystal-clear intelligence profile on them. Every antenna, every movement pattern, every routine, every weak point in their setup was being recorded and analyzed. This was not some dramatic scene from a movie. It was more like a free inspection, and the Russian crew had accidentally provided all the material. The aerial surveillance had already done its part. Quiet, precise, and impossible to ignore. But that was only the opening act. Then came the USCGC William Hart, a Sentinel-class fast response cutter, and a very clear signal that America's posture had shifted from observation to direct presence. The cutter moved fast. It left its pier in Honolulu and quickly pushed to high speed, with its twin MTU diesel engines sending nearly 6,000 horsepower through its water jets. This was not a heavy ship slowly forcing its way through the waves. It was a 154-foot blade moving sharply across the surface. In less than an hour, it was already in position. At that point, the Russian captain had very few choices. He could try to create distance, but his older hull, built more for steadiness than speed, could only reach around 16 knots. The William Hart, on the other hand, could hold 28 knots for as long as needed. The numbers simply did not favor the Russian vessel. The cutter completed its approach with calm precision. No dramatic announcements, no unnecessary theater. It simply made a tight, clean turn that the Russian ship could never match and settled into a perfect escort position, roughly 500 yards off Carolina's port side. The message was delivered without a single loud statement. Your speed does not change anything. Your turning ability does not change anything. We are here, and we are staying here. For the first time that day, the Russian captain may have realized this was not a scene where he controlled the situation. He was now the one being watched, measured, and guided. With the vessel pinned in place and fully visible, the Russian captain gave the order they had come all this way to carry out. Begin collection. It was a last attempt to save something from a mission that was already slipping away. On the bridge of the Carolina, the signals intelligence crew likely felt a sudden burst of purpose. Screens came alive. Systems were activated. Equipment began working. At last, they were doing what they had traveled thousands of miles to do. They thought they were the ones studying the situation. They had not yet understood that they were the main subject. First, they activated their primary search radar, the MR231, a broad and powerful system designed to map surface contacts in the area. For a moment, it may have looked like progress. The display began filling with targets, and the crew could probably feel that the mission was finally producing results. But aboard the HC-13, that radar signal was not merely noticed. It was immediately analyzed. The American system did not just detect a radar pulse. It recognized a familiar electronic signature, one that had been studied for decades. Every detail of that signal was captured, measured, and stored as a perfect digital reference. One system identified. Then the Russian crew activated their high-frequency communications array, trying to monitor naval channels and gather whatever signals they could reach. The system was powerful, sweeping across hundreds of frequencies every second. On paper, it looked like a classic signals intelligence move. But the moment it began transmitting, the American systems marked it immediately. The signature was captured, measured, and compared against existing data. Even its outdated encryption was noted. It was the digital equivalent of trying to protect a modern building with a lock from another era. It may have looked secure from the outside, but to the people watching from above, it was already an open file. Second system identified. Then, in what may have been a moment of overconfidence, the Russian crew activated their most sensitive piece of equipment. A specialized receiver designed to detect the faint electronic traces of advanced American aircraft. This was supposed to be their strongest card, the one system that could justify the entire mission. But that equipment came with a problem. To reach that level of sensitivity, it had to send out a tiny, unique calibration pulse. Almost nothing. Barely a whisper in the electronic noise around it. Unfortunately for them, the Hercules was built to hear whispers. Third system identified. In less than 10 minutes, the Russian crew had not gained any meaningful advantage. Instead, they had provided the Americans with a detailed electronic profile of their own vessel. Every major system they activated became another line in the American database. Every signal helped complete the picture. And the crew on the Carolina likely never realized how much they had revealed. After hours of being studied from every useful angle, the Carolina's mission had effectively ended. Not with drama, not with a sudden escape or a dramatic standoff. Just a quiet, unmistakable shift in direction. The HC-130 had already gathered what it needed. There was no need to chase. The Carolina slowly turned north, its large frame moving away from the area it had entered with far more confidence than results. The Americans continued to track it visually, not because they had to, but because the message mattered. It was the operational version of saying, "We see you, we know where you are, and we will keep watching until you leave." Back in Moscow, the story would almost certainly be polished into something more flattering. State media could call it a successful intelligence mission, a routine voyage through international waters, or a demonstration of naval presence. Of course. And by that logic, a ship running into an iceberg could be described as a successful test of its hull. But the numbers tell a much clearer story. Russia's investment was enormous. A voyage of roughly 10,000 miles. Weeks of fuel burned through aging engines. The cost of keeping 146 sailors supplied, paid, and committed to a mission that was supposed to prove something. And what did they get in return? Not much. What they did provide, however, was extremely useful to the United States. A high-definition, full-spectrum electronic profile of one of their key signals intelligence vessels. Frequencies, emissions, patterns, equipment behavior, system timing, structural details, and weak points, all neatly recorded and added to the American picture. The cost for Russia was likely well over $500,000, and that is a cautious estimate. The return was close to nothing, unless you count giving your opponent a carefully organized technical file on your own ship. America's investment was far smaller. A few hours of flight time for a proven HC-130 platform. A few hours of fuel for a fast response cutter that was operating well within its comfort zone. A routine patrol effort turned into a valuable intelligence opportunity, handed over almost for free by the very vessel that came looking for secrets. Total cost, probably under $70,000. In Pentagon terms, that is not even a serious line item. It is the kind of expense that gets buried so deep in the budget that nobody would bother putting a sticky note on it. The return, however, was enormous, a complete real-time intelligence package on a supposedly upgraded and strategically important Russian naval asset, neatly organized, searchable, and ready for analysis. This was not a dramatic victory in the movie trailer sense. No flags waving, no grand speeches, no heroic soundtrack. It was something colder and far more embarrassing for Moscow, a transaction, and mathematically it was not even close. The lesson was simple and sharp. You can send your best equipment, your most polished relic, your pride and glory ship halfway across the planet. But when the entire operation turns into a useful training exercise for a Coast Guard aircraft and a cutter that only had to follow you until you left, then maybe the real failure was not in the antennas, the sensors, or the encryption. Maybe the real failure was deciding to sail there in the first place. And beyond the numbers, beyond the one-sided cost-benefit calculation, the wider message carried even more weight than the Carolina's aging hull ever could. Because this did not happen in isolation. It happened in a year when the Pacific was already moving like a chessboard. China was testing boundaries in the South China Sea. North Korea was conducting launches so regularly that the schedule almost felt automated. And U.S. treaty allies were quietly strengthening their defense arrangements, like people checking every lock before a storm arrives. Russia, meanwhile, was playing a different game. It was trying to project relevance. With its navy stretched by commitments elsewhere and its economy under pressure, sending a long-range signals intelligence vessel into Pacific waters was not just a mission. It was supposed to be a message. We are still here. We are still watching. We still matter. But the message did not land the way Moscow intended. Instead of proving reach, they exposed limitations. Instead of gathering valuable information, they helped provide it. And instead of shaking confidence in the region, they accidentally reminded every Pacific ally, Japan, Australia, the Philippines, and South Korea, that the United States did not need to send an entire carrier task force to control the information space. A Coast Guard aircraft and a single cutter were enough. Inside the defense ministries of allied nations, the takeaway would have been quiet but unmistakable. The American surveillance network was not just effective, it was everywhere it needed to be. And Russia's attempt at a show of presence had turned into a case study in how not to project power. Even Beijing would have noticed. Not publicly, of course, but somewhere inside a PLA Navy briefing room, analysts were almost certainly updating their assessments. Not just about American strength, but about American quiet competence. The kind that does not need to make noise to prove a point. The kind that can turn a geopolitical gesture into a controlled demonstration using one aircraft and a cutter that normally spends much of its time enforcing maritime rules. For Russia, the incident would likely disappear from state media, buried beneath patriotic framing and domestic distractions. But inside the halls of its Naval Intelligence Command, the reality would remain uncomfortable. They had traveled halfway across the planet only to prove by accident that the ocean had never been more transparent, and that the United States did not need to make a grand move to make that clear.